Hi guys, in this video we're going to be discussing about consumer surplus. So guys, consumer surplus is the difference between what the consumers are willing to pay minus what they actually pay. Now let's take an example. Suppose you went to buy a chocolate and the price for that chocolate that you're willing to pay is, let's say, $15, right? And when you go to the market, you see that the chocolate is actually priced in the market at $10. So you were willing to pay $15 for that chocolate and the price of that chocolate is $10. So $5 is the consumer surplus that you have gained from buying and consuming that chocolate. So guys, consumer surplus refers to the welfare gain of the consumers. It is that benefit, it is that welfare benefit that the consumers have actually received for paying a much lower price or a lower price for something that they were ready and willing to pay a much higher price for. So technically what has happened is that they have bought a product at a much lower price than as compared to the price they were willing to pay for. So don't you think, isn't it a welfare gain for consumers? Don't you think it is a benefit for consumers? Because the consumer could have paid a much higher price for a chocolate and he was willing to pay a much higher price for a chocolate, but he got that chocolate at a much lower price. So guys, this is the basic definition of what consumer surplus is. So I've written it over here that consumer surplus is basically the difference between what consumers are actually willing to pay. That is what the consumer thinks he is going to buy that product for, or the maximum amount that he is actually willing to pay for that, let's suppose, a particular unit, minus that is a difference of what they actually pay for, that is the market price. So one more thing guys, a lot of students write in the exam that consumer surplus is the area above the price and below the demand curve. Now that is not wrong guys, but that is not the definition of what consumer surplus is. That is just a graphical representation of consumer surplus. That is, how are we going to represent consumer surplus on a graph? We will say that consumer surplus represents the area that is under the demand curve and above the market price, under the demand curve and above the market price. So all of this area is basically this triangle, that is triangle A, B and C. This triangle is representing the area of consumer surplus. It is that welfare gain that the consumer has received because he wanted to pay a much higher price for something, or he was willing to pay a much higher price for something, I must say, and he actually got that particular product, he consumed that product at a much lower price. Okay guys, so we have already looked at the basic concept of what consumer surplus is. Now I'm going to just draw a table and just plug in some figures, and then we're going to calculate the consumer surplus. So first of all, you guys must be knowing that the demand curve for a product is also the marginal utility curve, because the demand curve represents the willingness and the ability to buy a product, which means that if I say that the consumer is willing and able to buy something, it also represents the amount of utility that he will gain from the consumption of any point on that particular demand curve. So let's take an example. So guys, demand curve is also the marginal utility curve. So let's say this represents the demand curve for chocolates, and let's say that the price of chocolates in the market is, let's say, $7, and let's say that now I'm going to be writing over here marginal utility, right? And the difference between marginal utility and the price is the marginal consumer surplus. Now this is representing marginal consumer surplus. Now this is representing the additional surplus that the consumer has gained from consuming each additional unit of something. So let's take units of chocolates over here. So let's say if I consume the first chocolate, I am actually willing to pay how much? I am willing to pay So let's say if I consume the first chocolate, I am willing to pay $11 for it. Gosh, $11 for a chocolate that is priced $7, because for me, I love that chocolate. The first unit of chocolate will obviously give me a much higher utility. So guys, if I know, if I'm saying that, you know what, for the first chocolate I'm ready to pay $11 for it, then I can also fairly say that $11 is the utility I will gain from the consumption of that first chocolate. Now imagine that I am saying that the first chocolate will yield me a utility of $11 because I am willing to pay $11 for it. So for anything that I am willing to pay $11 for, it means that I am also going to get a utility, a satisfaction of $11 for it. That is why I was willing to pay $11 for it. But how much did I pay for? I paid $7, right? So how much is the consumer surplus or the welfare gain or the additional benefit, or you can say the benefit the consumer has gained from the consumption of the first unit of chocolate, and that welfare gain is represented to the consumer surplus, and that is how much? That is $4. So $4 is the consumer surplus from the consumption of the first chocolate. Now the second unit of chocolate would obviously not yield the same satisfaction or that the consumer received from buying the first chocolate, because we know the concept of diminishing marginal utility, which states that as you consume more and more chocolates or additional units, the additional utility that you will gain from the consumption of an additional unit will decrease as more units are consumed. So because of the diminishing marginal utility, what is going to happen is that the second chocolate would not yield the same utility as the first chocolate. And let's say that now the utility from the consumption of chocolate, let's say, falls to $10. So the second chocolate would only be worth $10 for the consumer, which means that how much will he be willing to pay? He will be only willing to pay $10 for it, because that is the utility he thinks he will gain from it, right? What is the market price? The market price is $7. So what is the consumer surplus? Guys, the consumer surplus is $3. Now we can see that the consumer surplus has actually fallen by the consumption of the second chocolate, and the simple reason is that the marginal utility is falling. So obviously the additional units would not gain that additional welfare gain for the consumer because of the diminishing marginal utility, right? So guys, let's say that the consumer is willing to pay let's say $8 for this chocolate. Now the consumer is willing to pay only $8 for this chocolate, which means that the third unit will yield him a marginal utility or an additional utility. We know that marginal utility is representing the additional utility he will gain from the consumption of the third chocolate. So the additional utility is $8. So if I am going to yield a utility of $8 from the third chocolate, it also means that I am only be willing to pay $8 for it. So guys, for something that I am willing to pay $8 for it, but the price is $7. So what is the consumer surplus? The consumer surplus is $1, which is represented by a welfare gain to the consumer from the consumption of the third chocolate. Now, although we see that the consumer surplus is falling from the consumption of each additional chocolate, but still the consumer surplus is positive. There is still a welfare gain for the consumer. So the consumer is like, you know what, I still have a positive gain, I still have a welfare gain. Although the welfare gain is declining, but still it is a positive figure, right? There is still a gain, which means that the consumer will keep on continuing buying chocolates, right? Now the fourth chocolate would yield him a utility of, let's say, $7, right? These are all hypothetical figures that I have just assumed in order to explain you guys the concept. So $7 is the utility that the consumer will gain from the consumption of the fourth chocolate. Now the fourth chocolate is worth how much? The fourth chocolate is worth $7, which means now there is no consumer surplus that the consumer is going to gain, which means that the consumer surplus is actually zero, which also means that there is no welfare gain for the consumer, because for the fourth chocolate cost him $7, he was willing to pay $7, so there's no welfare gain. Now what is the total so now remember one thing, we know that consumers will be able to rationalize or optimize their purchases at a point where the price is equal to the marginal utility. Now I'm not going to be going into that much detail because that is kind of an A2 concept, and we're going to be covering that in some other video. But right now remember that the fourth chocolate would actually cost the consumer $7, and he will only purchase up to a point where price is equals to marginal utility, which is known as the point of allocative efficiency, where the price equals the marginal utility, because at the fourth chocolate whatever he was willing to pay is also equal to the price. Now if, for example, let's say if he buys the fifth chocolate, at that point what is going to happen is that if he buys the fifth chocolate, that fifth chocolate would cost him $7, but the marginal utility or the amount of money that he's willing to pay would only cost him he would only be willing to pay $6 for it. Now which means that there would be a negative consumer surplus, which means that buying the fifth chocolate would pull down his total welfare gain. So that is why now this would not represent a rational decision or you can say an allocatively efficient decision to buy 5 chocolates. That is why the consumer will only end up buying 4 chocolates, right? So guys, what I'll do is that I'll erase this, right? Let me see where the duster is. Okay, so I'll just rub it. Okay, so what is the total consumer surplus? 4 plus 3 plus 1, that is 5, 6, 7 and 8. So guys, $8 is the total consumer surplus, and we can calculate this value also through the diagram. How? Very simple, which is we know that the triangle ABC, now this triangle ABC represents the area or the total amount of welfare gain to consumers, that is the area of consumer surplus. Now let's calculate the numerical value of this triangle. It also comes in MCQs as well. So it's very simple. The formula for the area of triangle is half times base times height. What is the base? The base should be 4 into 4. So half times 4 half times 4, the height will be 11 minus 7, that is also 4 into 4, so that would be equal to 8 as well, and we can see that this matches with our value of $8, and here we see that the consumer surplus that we calculated through this table is also equal to the area of consumer surplus from this diagram. So guys, what is the take home lesson from this video? What did you guys learn? You guys learned how do you define consumer surplus? You define consumer surplus by saying that it is a welfare gain for consumers. It represents a benefit for consumers because they are willing to pay more but they pay less because the market price is less. So that difference represents the consumer surplus or the benefit to consumers from consuming that particular product at a much lower price than they were willing to pay, and it is represented through a demand diagram, that is, it represents the area under the demand curve above the market price. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Stay tuned, more videos coming your way. See you next time.